Hi, I'm Kirsten Quinn, your host, and this is the Philadelphia Cultural Forum on CCP TV, Community College of Philadelphia's educational channel. Tonight we have with us Debra Lee Scott. Debra is a professional writer, playwright, singer, filmmaker, educator, dramaturg, editor, arts administrator, public speaker, and activist, often all at the same time. She's currently working on 2 novels, a documentary film, and a short play. Debra teaches in the Intellectual Heritage Program at Temple University and also runs her own workshops in writing and experiential creativity. She is one of the co-founders of Sisterdelphia, a new women's theater arts collaborative in Philadelphia, and an outspoken activist on issues of arts and education. Welcome, Debra, to the show. Thank you so much for coming on the show and for sharing with us your work today. You're going to be sharing some of your fiction, short story with us.
Yes.
I'd like to talk a little bit about how you started out in the field of writing and what your process is like for you a little bit.
I don't have any one process. I think that it really depends on the project.
Okay.
The first collection of short stories took me probably close to 7 years, I'm embarrassed to say.
No, you shouldn't be embarrassed. I mean, that perfects the work.
Well, it was sort of that was a weird process because I was writing the short stories almost as sketches for the novel, which has the same characters in it.
Okay.
And then the short stories just kind of took on a life of their own and needed more shaping, and it just was a separate project. And then the novel became a trilogy. So I was doing a Peter Jackson sort of thing. I was writing all of these things at the same time, 2 of which still aren't finished. But the first novel is now more or less finished, and this the collection of short stories is finished and is out. My plays seem to move faster, especially if I have deadlines and I know actors and a director are waiting. I can write fast. And I think I've learned to write a little bit faster with my fiction, but it depends on the project.
Depends on the project.
It absolutely depends on it. And it's sort of discovering a world that I don't know. So with every project I'm going in and I'm getting to know these people and what they're doing, and I have to kind of hang back and let them do what they're going to do and get familiar with it and then write it. So
you really work from characters and so you build along with the characters.
Really character-driven stuff for the most part. I think people fascinate me, and I try to figure psychology out, not in a formal sense, but just through the fascinating things that people do.
Right, and a lot of your work that I've read and seen has fascinating characters. You really write strong characters for women, from what I've seen, but you also do all kinds of, there's a full range of the type of work. I mean, you may talk about social activism, you may do something with a gothic bent to it. I mean, there's a really wide range of material. I know that you started a program called Hidden River Arts. When did you start that? How did that come about, and what are you doing with that now?
It's been a labor of love for about 10 years.
Okay.
And I started it very small with a fiction competition once a year.
Okay.
We grew that a little bit to a fiction and a drama competition yearly. And just slowly, incrementally increased the programs that we were doing. We do outreach programs. I run workshops, creative writing workshops.
Right.
And we, just within the last, I think we're coming up on our 2nd anniversary for the press. We have a small independent press, and it's really small. We have 3 titles out. The 4th is on its way out, and then the 5th is sort of coming behind that. And the 5th book, I should mention, is the first winner of our newest award, which is the Eladia Award. It's a book-length work of fiction, either a collection of short stories or a novel. Has to be a first-time book-length work of fiction by a woman 40 and older.
Okay.
Because I've noticed that all of the competitions seem to want the 20-somethings.
Younger crowd.
And a lot of women who have raised their families and lived a good portion of their life have a lot to say, and not as many people seem to want to hear it.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, we'll do the Eladia Award. I named it after my grandmother, who never ever had a chance to be the artist that she could have been because she was born way too early. Right. And the winner is actually a local woman named Tree Reasoner.
Okay. Yeah,
So
I know Tree.
it's really exciting because we're going to be working to put the book together now. Part of the award is publication.
Okay.
So that will be our 5th book out. And then after all of the press stuff got launched, we launched a gallery. And we're now working with more visual artists, and we're doing outreach, and with every gallery opening, we have interdisciplinary activities. So live music, visual arts, readings, we've even had dance.
Oh, really?
So yeah, so we're doing a lot, and I'd like to expand that a little bit so that maybe we'll do some one-act readings and things like that as well. So
When you've published several things, several books. You've had your plays performed many places, and there's a short story collection that you're going to be reading from today. And I'd like you to just give us a little bit of background on that, and then have you read from the book.
This is the only book that's published so far.
Okay.
The novel, there's a small press waiting to publish it, but I've pulled it because I decided that I wanted to do a little bit more editing. And that was probably a mistake because it's been sitting now kind of, I don't know, going unconscious on me. So I have to jump into that and really make myself do it. But the collection of short stories is an interdisciplinary, interconnected set of stories. There are 3 characters who sort of appear in each one of the stories, 2 sisters and a cousin.
Okay.
The 2 sisters, the Meade sisters, are Army brats. Their dad is in Special Forces, and most of their life is spent in and around, Fort Bragg and military areas. They are children of the 50s and 60s. The book starts in 1955, and it ends actually the day Saigon falls, April 30th, 1975, because it has that sort of military trajectory to it. The cousin is the same age as them. She is a biracial child of the mother's brother.
Okay.
And they just have these painful, astonishing kinds of experiences through a time that was, I guess, in a lot of ways similar to ours. I mean, the time of tumult, through the 60s especially, the changes, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the anti-war movement. So they were coming of age during that time. And the stories sort of pop through that whole time period, and we get to know these girls from the time they are little until the time they're in their 20s. And it sort of leaves off in 1975. But they're still back here. And they're old ladies, I guess, now. So I'm going to have to revisit them at some point when I get the other projects under control. Because I would like to know what's happened to them since 1975. I don't know if anybody else will, but I'm curious.
I'm sure we all will.
I don't know.
Let's hear from the book. Let's hear a little bit about these fascinating people and stories.
Hope they're fascinating. It's called Other Likely Stories. I don't know if I mentioned that. And the story I'm going to be reading is one of the earliest. It's a story of the cousin, and it's a story where it's called All the Accidents of Man. Their house burns down, and they need to sort of leave town. And the family is, sort of gloriously dysfunctional. So I'll just jump in, and what I'm going to do, I think, is jump around through the story and try to kind of explain where I'm leaving off and where I'm jumping back in again.
Terrific.
Okay. In August of '59, our home in Alabama burned, not badly, but just enough that we had to move. It was a fast fire that my brother Martin and I saw blaze through most of the first floor and part of the second. We sat watching the firemen pull hoses across our lawn, listening to their yells and to the sounds of shattering glass above the roar of the water. Neighbors gathered in small groups on the sidewalk across the street. They stood watching calmly, talking together, measuring the fire's effect. Not one among them approached our family. Our father was in a rage, throwing armloads of sopping, unrecognizable stuff from the house into the back of our station wagon. At first, our mother yelled for him to stop, her voice rising into the night, but shouting made her ashamed, and she stopped quickly, her face turning hard and fierce in its silence. She sat on the wet sidewalk, hugging her legs until dawn approached, staring mutely as the firemen pulled their hoses up and packed their equipment into the truck. My brother, who was 7, had pieced together some information and explained it to me. Dad says we're bank robbed, he said, unless we go to the beach. This all sounded fine to me, and I started to yell hooray, but one glance at my mother's swollen, angry eyes stopped me mid-holler, and that's when she pulled me to her, hard. Marlena, don't let anybody or anything stop you from doing what you feel, she said. You just go on and yell if you want to. I don't need to, Mommy, I said. It's okay. She knelt down and drew us both to her, Martin and me, looking secretly in the direction of my father. This was nobody's fault, she whispered. Not yours, not mine. The fireman said so. Do you understand? We both nodded, feeling her arms around our backs, her protection against whatever truths were hid. After the fire trucks pulled away down the street, my father stormed toward us, and without breaking stride, hoisted Martin and me up into his arms. He dumped us into the back of the car on top of the wet piles. My mother climbed silently into the front seat. My dad floored the gas, burning tire marks all the way off the street. We were leaving the house charred, drenched, and abandoned behind us. He didn't care that my brother and I were looking, but when my mother turned to watch the house shrink in the distance, he roared, "You face forward, God damn you." "Don't you try blaming me for this, Vince," she said. And like a flash, he yanked a handful of her hair, whipping her head toward him and swerving down the road. "How the hell are you going to stop me, Ronnie?" he said. So they drive on to a place called Wellerton Beach. It's where his parents live, in this tiny little beach cottage. It doesn't have any room really for this family that is showing up on their doorstep. And the parents, his parents, don't much like the wife.
Okay.
But anyway, they move in, they empty out a large pantry closet, and they turn that closet into a bedroom, a bunk bedroom for the 2 little kids.
Okay.
My grandfather emptied out a large pantry closet and pushed a bunk bed into the space. My father removed the door from its hinges and hung a curtain over the opening, and this was where Martin and I slept, and we loved it. The very best thing about sleeping there was that the grown-ups forgot we were only behind a curtain, not a door, and that we could hear everything they did or said. We would lie still and listen, trying to imagine their actions by the sounds that we heard. As for conversations, what few there were, Martin explained those to me with great authority at times, and I realize now with great freedom from the constraints of fact. My dad had just lost another construction job in Alabama before the house burned. So it was actually better here, where he could work with his father and not worry about getting into his regular trouble. Here, he helped plaster houses for the town people of Wellerton and for people in other places with names Martin and I loved to chant, like Choctaw Hatchie, Crooked Island, Dead Lake. We conjured Indian villages, beaches with twisted trees, spirits rising from the misty waters. From our curtained beds off the kitchen, we listened for the sounds of men waking at dawn, preparing themselves to travel toward the wonders we imagined. Martin played lookout, and whenever it seemed safe, he'd peek out of the curtain, reporting, for instance, that they only wore socks and boxers in the kitchen. They stood, dressed in this peculiar way, and fixed their coffee at the counter, and sometimes they'd pour from a brown bottle Grandfather kept under the sink, right into their coffee. This was meant to be a secret, but my grandmother sniffed at those cups they left behind each morning. So I'm going to jump a little bit again. The situation with the mother and the grandmother was pretty hostile. The grandmother really doesn't like this woman at all. If the silence of the men felt like religion to my brother and me, the silence of the women felt like war. They moved around each other, spoke around each other. They worked, never quite together, to keep house. Grandmother wore flower print dresses and amber beads. Even as young as I was, I felt this as an assault to my mother, who wore whatever she had left after the fire, pieces that didn't match the season or each other. It made her stay inside most times. She never got to be like the lady on the beach billboard that we drove past on the way in. "Why do you hate my mother?" I asked my grandmother one day. She had been smoothing a bedspread across the pillows of her bed, and she straightened up, looking past me out the screened window. "God tells us not to hate anyone, Marlena," she said, "and he knows how hard I try." "Well, how come he can't help you do better?" I asked. My grandmother concentrated on tucking a piece of sheet back into the bed. "Because," she said, "I guess we're meant to suffer the consequences of what we fail to do." "Well, if you're the one who can't do better," I asked, "how come it's my mom who always cries?" "Your mother cries because she married a man she had no right to marry," my grandmother said. I'm going to jump again. What happens is that the mother discovers that she's pregnant again. And this is not good news. So at one point, the grandfather, who doesn't speak to anybody, really barely even talks to his wife, occasionally will talk to his son on the way to the jobs, or as they're drinking the whiskey-laced coffee in the morning. He spoke to no one but my father, and that only occasionally. Still, it was he, on one of those occasional times, who told my father one of my mother's secrets, that she was leaving in the early hours of the morning and staying out till nearly dawn. He said it one morning while they were stirring their coffee, and I listened behind the curtain. "That woman you got hauled herself out of here around 1 this morning, didn't get back till daybreak," is what he said exactly. I peeked out of the curtain right away when I heard that and saw him sitting with his back toward me. My father never looked up from his coffee, never answered. But I knew he'd have my mother out on the dock that night to speak about it. That was where they went when they needed to be private. Sometimes, if I knew they were going, I'd have just enough time to climb under the dock and listen. Martin taught me how to do it. I would crouch on the bank where it rose just above the water line and dig my fingers deeply into the spongy muck to keep myself from sliding into the water. This night, I got there just in time, before my parents' feet sounded on the boards above me. I watched their shadows flicker down through the slats of wood and float on the moonlight water as it rolled over my bare toes. It was hard for my father to ask her, and he stumbled through his words. "I won't ask you the why of it," he said finally, "but you owe me to say who you're going to see." "It's not meant to cost you," was all she answered. My father didn't talk again right away, and when he did, his voice had changed into something thicker than before, so that his words bubbled through and broke surface. "Everything you do, Ronnie," he whispered, "every goddamn thing you do." I knew even he didn't understand enough of anything to ask her the right questions, and I think he knew it too. But I knew where she went, even if my father didn't, because after a while, she started taking Martin and me with her. She'd fill the back of the station wagon with blankets and pillows and carry us out in the early morning hours. She'd drive, and we'd fall back to sleep. Sometimes she would only drive through the back roads of the forest, and we would wake to see the dark sky and its stars through the windows of the back. Other times we'd wake up in the driveway of our Gretna house. The overgrown grass, the dirty windows, the weeds growing up between the cracks where the fire trucks split the driveway, made it look as if no one had ever lived here or could ever live here again. Sometimes our mother let us out of the car to run through the backyard in the moonlight. She stayed inside the house, trying her best to put things back together. We lay on the grass outside looking up at the constellations. We ate donuts from a box and drank orange juice from a carton. Martin swallowed his right down, but I took small bites, chewing slowly, feeling the tightness of my throat as a warning that this was the night my mother could find some evidence against me, proof of a guilt I couldn't specify, something that would cause her to take her love away. But each time, the sky would begin to lighten, and Mom would tuck us back into the back of the wagon, heading south toward the Gulf again. If she ever found a reason to deny me her tenderness, she never said a thing about it. It's the little girl who set the fire. And Marlena, through this whole book, is something of a pyromaniac. So she actually burns things down a good bit through this collection, right up until the very last story that she's in. When my mother found that another baby was coming, the rides got more frequent. The trips home became more regular. It got so that Martin and I spent more nights getting our whole night's sleep in the back of the wagon. Sometimes we never woke at all, but my mother, sleeping less and less, would wander our empty house for hours alone, sometimes working, sometimes eating the canned or packaged food left in the cupboards, drinking the instant coffee black in the left-behind mugs. Let me see if I can jump again. One night in August, the heat was so bad that Mom only packed bed sheets, no blankets, and she said we'd feel cooler. It would feel cooler against our skin if we slept in our underwear and powdered up our legs and arms and neck. We did, and used up most of a can of talc until our skin was white and the crevices where our arms folded were filled with lines of wet white dough. The back of the station wagon was foggy with the dust of the powder and sweet with its smell. My hair and my brother's were powdered white. We looked ancient, 80, 90 years old, wrapped in bleached white sheets that still held the odor of chlorine mixed with the aroma of our oatmeal cookies. My mother was enormous now, walked with a rolling motion. She had pinned her hair up with bobby pins and dabbed at her face and chest with a tissue. The cotton of her sack blouse was wrinkled and limp, and I could make out what I didn't know then was the bulge of her popped-out belly button. We slept in powdered sweetness all through the ride, through black roads, through the black trees, under the black skies. My mother had cranked down the big back window of the wagon and opened all the car windows down to the door frames. As she drove, the radio played music that only she could hear, but the hint of sound that floated on the delicious wind of movement was enough to keep us peaceful in our dreams. I don't know if we were headed home that night, or if my mother just planned to drive until daybreak. I don't know if she ever planned one or the other, but on this night, the decision was made for her as a buck flung himself through the black, stifling air and landed, young, strong, expectant, right in the middle of Route 77. My mother had no time to stop or swerve. Her headlights dazzled him, stunned him so that he stopped stiff, mesmerized, staring straight into the brilliance that blinded him, and she barreled down on his stillness and collided. Somehow our bodies, my brother's and mine, were thrown through the back of the wagon window, through the opening, and we awoke already skidding through the forest tangles, still wrapped in bed sheets and covered with talc. The car, by the time we realized that we should look for it, must have skidded far into the woods, where we, at 7 and 5, couldn't see and were too terrified to go. We were found crying at the side of the road by a couple who had heard the accident. They ran a motel a short walk down the highway and gathered us to them without questioning, 2 children in underwear and sheets powdered white and spotted with blood, whose footsteps sent little bursts of talc into the air as they stumbled in the darkness. The couple fed us corn on the cob, chicken, milk, and several slices each of chocolate cake. 2 state policemen came into the kitchen where we were eating and crying and talked to the couple. They only looked at us a little, then left. The people finished feeding us and then made our beds on their sofa. One of the troopers returned to say that he found the buck, who had dragged himself off to the edge of a small lake within the woods and died, the hole in his side torn clean open to his organs. His head flopped sadly in a dark pool of liquid. The car had traveled on for some distance and was found against a tree, in no condition to be salvaged. Its dashboard and front seat were scattered with bobby pins, glass, and blood, but no one was in the car. After more searching, they found a woman. She was conscious, whimpering, bloody, under some brush off the other side of the road, and it took them some time to realize that she was giving birth. They finally helped her in the last minutes before dawn to deliver a baby girl who the trooper said had the most beautiful big eyes he had ever seen in a child. So, obviously, she's taken to a hospital, and the children are brought back home to the dad, and the troopers drive them home. They get to the door as the men, it's dawn, and the men are loading up the truck for the next trip out to work. The patrol car slows down, pulls into the driveway, and my grandfather took one look, turned his back, and walked into the house. My father looked up and stiffened. He stared at the police car, his arms tightening around the tarp he was just about to throw onto the truck. As the trooper spoke, my father squinted so hard that his left eye twitched and blinked. Finally, we were left out of the car, and my father lifted us up in one scoop, Martin and me, and the sheets we were still wrapped in. He carried us into the house, and he stayed with us that whole day. One time, I saw him look out the window and hold his head, as if his eyes hurt him dreadfully. His jaw muscles worked and worked, as if he was chewing something so terrible he just didn't know how to swallow. So when the mom comes home from the hospital, he sort of gets himself together and he decides that they have to move back to their house in Alabama.
Okay.
So a very short time after that, my father moved us back to the house, and we never saw Wellerton or my grandparents again. And then my father did an unexpected thing. He declared that he would stop drinking. "It's time I woke up, Ronnie," he said to my mother. Martin and I thought this could be just the thing that my mother needed, just the thing to bring back her strength and her will. So we stopped what we were doing and waited, watching her. She was standing in the kitchen when he said it, the baby crawling around her feet. She stood looking at the sincere expression on my father's face for a full minute. Then she began, very slowly, but with great strength and will, to break everything in the room. She broke chairs, she broke dishes, she broke windows. Then she broke every glass in the cupboard except for one, which she held in her hand. My father scooped Miranda into his arms and held her against his chest. My mother looked first at them, then at the glass, as if it were an artifact from a forgotten lifetime. And at last she opened her hand and let the glass drop. It was as if there was some kind of rupture within her, and that was all. The next morning she was gone. The lives we lived went on without her because no one knew how to stop them. Our father retreated into drunken silence and hoped we would leave him alone. He never spoke of my mother's name again. Martin and I learned to speak of her only to each other and in secret waves. When I was old enough to leave home, it seemed right to follow in my mother's footsteps, wherever they might lead. It wasn't so much that I expected to find her as that I hoped she'd reappear. I pinned up my hair, I drove until dawn, I did whatever I thought might conjure her, but nothing happened. It seemed I'd never found a way of being where my mother, too, might be. Sometimes I wondered, should I just forget she's out there? The distances between us, no matter what they promised, held, extended beyond the lines of any map, in all and every infinite direction. And I think I'm going to end it there.
It's beautiful.
You look like you're going to cry. I'm sorry.
No, please don't. I mean, it's a very emotional story, and the characters you've created, particularly the cousin, the narrator, I can't help but wonder what's going to happen next. So,
nothing good. She, through the story, she spends a good portion of her life searching for this mother.
Right.
And by the time we get to the end of the book, well, I'm not going to tell you what happens because then people won't buy the book.
Right.
But there is a sort of payoff at the end.
Okay.
She unravels through these stories pretty seriously.
Okay.
The reason that I think starting the book with all of them as children is that you can see what formed the wounds that they all carried, and I think for me at least the most important thing is that we all carry wounds, and it's about how to transcend them, and the love that they have for each other is part of what helps them to transcend that, and just a willingness to keep going out there and trying all the time. So that's why I want to revisit these people, because I want to know what happens to them, after they're in their 20s. What happens when they become.
I want to hear what happens to them too. And thank you so much for being here and for sharing with us.
Me.
And for sharing with us about your different programs. There's another program that you can find out more about, Sister Delphia, which is very new. And so thank you, Debra.
Thank you so much for having me.
For
Thanks,
having
Kirsten.
me, for sharing your beautiful work with us. I'm sure the audience's interest is piqued. And to find out more about Debra's many upcoming projects, go to her website. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. It's www.debraleescott.com. And that's all the time we have for now, but we'll see you next time on the Philadelphia Cultural Forum on CCP TV, Community College of Philadelphia's educational channel. Good night, everyone.